Welcome to Lexington Public Library's Tales from the Kentucky Room podcast, where we explore Lexington's history and people. I'm your host, David Bryant, and in each episode, we will feature a guest who will share a piece of local history. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy. Welcome back to the Tales from the Kentucky Room podcast. I'm your host, David Bryant, and today I'm speaking with Zach Davis about historic and lost Lexington cemeteries. Welcome, Zach.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Aaron.
It's great to talk to you. So a little bit of information about Zach to get started. Zach is a lifelong Lexingtonian, and he's the president and principal broker of the Kirkpatrick and Company. Zach studied history at Transylvania University, and he spent a lot of time studying historic architecture of the bluegrass. I thought that was interesting because people may not always piece that together, being in real estate, and just how much a part of the job is researching properties and deeds and titles. So Zach approached me recently about doing a podcast on Lexington cemeteries. And I really thought this was a perfect time of year for a topic like this because weather's getting warmer and people might like to go out and explore some of these cemeteries a bit. Zach, what attracted you to this topic?
Thank you, David. Yes, in the course of our work, whenever we go to market and sell we specialize in farms and land, which frequently will have an old house or old buildings. We like to research who built either the house, who designed it, who occupied it in subsequent years. We do as much title work as we can, which especially on farms can get very interesting and sometimes tricky. But the more you dig at it, the more interesting it becomes.
Did you have a cemetery you wanted to start with?
Part of our work, whenever we are marketing something that's so deeply connected to an individual or a family, we inevitably research them and frequently find their final resting place, whether it be in Lexington or another county. But yes, Lexington, I mean, obviously, the modern Lexington has been settled for 250 years now, roughly. And really, the very first burying ground out of necessity was the pioneer of the McConnell Cemetery. According to historian Frank Dunn, it is located on a sliver of land behind what we call the New Catholic Cemetery on West Main, Calvary. It's 150 years old, but we still call it the New Catholic Cemetery. And I was able to find a picture of Dunn in the July 31st, 1949 Herald Leader, and he's pointing to a spot on the ground as to where the McConnell graveyard is. The only problem is there's nothing in the picture to give you a landmark of where he is standing. I'm sure Wayne Johnson knows where it is, but I've gone over there and walked, and I can't find anything. And unfortunately, it's at the intersection of a few rail lines, and so I'm sure over the years, if there were any stones, they're long gone.
And for people who may not know, we're talking McConnell of
William McConnell, yeah,
of McConnell Springs. Yeah. What about the Maxwell burial ground?
So that's kind of a heartbreak. John Maxwell, again, one of the first individuals here, and I think he actually participated in the naming of Lexington. His land was basically where Mill Street, South Limestone, and what we know today as Bolivar. For millennials listening, that's where the Laser Quest used to be. That was part of his land, and he set it aside, a piece of it, for his family to be buried, and he in essence, deeded it to the city or to the city trustees with the understanding that it would always remain a cemetery, and if it ever wasn't a cemetery, that the land would revert back to the Maxwell family. At some point, the city bought some adjoining land to have as the city burying ground for those who perhaps could not afford a lot in another cemetery or maybe didn't belong to a congregation or died without family or heirs. The city had a place to bury them with dignity. At some point in the 1880s, I think, the city decided it was overgrown, it was more of a nuisance than anything else now, and oh, by the way, we have a buyer. And so it was sold. Unfortunately, a factory was built on top of it, much to the dismay of many citizens who expressed that in the paper. The plan proceeded, construction took place. Of course, they dishonorably disinterred people. And to this day, UK owns a lot of that land now. Whenever they're doing a construction project, it's not uncommon to see on the news bones found in the UK dig over, in 2024 or 5, because yes, it was and really still is a cemetery.
Do you know at this time in the era of John Maxwell to be buried in a cemetery like that, was that more common for like the average person? Would a person with more means be buried like in a family? Like if they own property, would it be more likely that they were buried on their own property?
Frequently. I mean, the concept of what we have today in the Lexington Cemetery or Calvary Cemetery was not the norm at that time by any means.
Mhm.
You had an Episcopal burying ground, you had the Catholic burying ground, you had a Presbyterian cemetery. Certainly the Jewish community at one point had their own separate piece of land. It wasn't until the founding of Lexington Cemetery in 1849, that new concept at the time of the, I forget what they called it, the rural or the agrarian setting cemetery was really taking hold in America in the mid-19th century, that you have these pieces of land purchased by the community, dedicated to be a beautiful resting place forever, and it would be treed and landscaped, and community members would visit, not only to visit their loved ones, but to have a picnic or to just breathe the fresh air outside of the city proper, which at the time, Lexington Cemetery was outside of the city proper.
Yeah, very much so. And I've actually read before that these cemeteries were in some ways the predecessor to the modern city park.
Very much so.
That people thought, well, we could just have the park without all the graves and still spend time outside.
Yes, yeah. Get outside. It's good for you.
What about the another really well-known Lexington cemetery is the Old Episcopal Burying Ground?
It's extraordinarily well-known to the point of almost being overstudied, which is fine, but people, and I see why. It is such an utterly charming and beautiful place. It wasn't always like that. You have the Sexton's Cottage, which was designed, I believe, by McMurtry, but it's just a lovely place to be. And I say it wasn't always like that. I mean, the Episcopalians certainly did a better job at keeping it up than the adjoining, what we call the Old Catholic Burying Ground, or I've seen references to it as the Old Irish burying ground because of the concentration of Lexington's Irish Catholic population at the time. Following the founding of Calvary Cemetery in 1874, the Little Catholic Cemetery, which for those listening would be between today's Central Fire Station and the Episcopal Burying Ground, and today they refer to it as the London Farrell Community Garden. So that lot was purchased by the Catholics and was held by the church until the year 2000. But once Calvary was formed, a lot of families disinterred and relocated their loved ones into the new Catholic cemetery on West Main. And the old Catholic cemetery, unfortunately, fell into disrepair. It was overgrown. People would go there to commit petty crimes. It was not a good place to be. And so there were discussions in the paper in the mid-20th century about what do we as a community do with these two burying grounds, both the Catholic and the Episcopal, that have almost not been forgotten, but we'll get to it one day. It came to a point where something has got to give. And so the Episcopal burying ground was certainly had some cleanup, but not as much as the Catholic cemetery, which they, unfortunately, I mean, hindsight's 2020, they chose to, those persons that were not relocated to the new Catholic cemetery, people in the 50s, took their stones that were remaining and put them in the corner. Just relocated the stones back to the back corner of the cemetery.
Okay.
So we still have many people there. And they might not mind that it's a community garden, but they're still very much there.
Wow. So the Old Catholic Cemetery became the London Farrell Community Garden.
Yes.
Okay. But London, to add another layer of confusion, London Farrell is buried in the old Episcopal burying ground.
And he was a Baptist
okay.
man of color who was the pastor of the church. It was on East Short at Deweese, and I'm forgetting the name. But he was the long-time, well-respected pastor of that congregation.
Yeah, he was like a very well-known figure at the time. I think that they said that he baptized thousands of people in Lexington. Yeah. Going back to the Episcopal burying ground, do you know who was buried there?
I mean, there have been books written about it, as you know. I mean, I tend to, because there is so much focus on the Old Episcopal burying ground, I tend not to focus on it. I want to focus on things that haven't really been studied, people that haven't been highlighted. And really, before we talk about even First Hill, which again, Lexingtonians pass thousands of times every day on West Main, one of those cemeteries that really has been forgotten would be Forest Hill, which is over at the intersection, I believe it's Whitney and Ash Streets. It directly adjoins the Lexington Cemetery. It's separated by a chain link fence, and it also directly adjoins Cove Haven Cemetery, formerly known as Greenwood.
Okay.
And again, I think there's just a chain link fence separating it, but it's in essence 3 or 4 residential lots that were, instead of being used for homes, used as a cemetery for a very long time. And it eventually became, again, a subsequent city burying ground where people who could not afford a lot at the Lexington Cemetery or who died without anybody to care for them, the city would use Forest Hill to inter them. And really, unfortunately, it looks like a lot on the surface. Some years ago, the city did have to bring in some fill dirt and spread it across the surface because the surface had become so uneven over the centuries of burying people there in pine boxes. And also, interestingly enough, in 2011, the city deeded those lots, Lot B, C, D, and E, in Block B on Whitney Avenue. They sold them to an adjoining property owner for $11,000. I looked, I could not find any restrictions of record saying nothing could be built there, or it's understood by all parties that this is a cemetery and shall remain such in perpetuity. But there are no stones. There are maybe 3 or 4
wow.
stones.
Okay.
Other than that, you would never know it was a cemetery. And I was talking with my wife, Natalie, who went to Center College and has a master's in library information science. She said, surely
we know
could,
Natalie well.
Sure, well, she does a lot of this with me. But she said, surely we could get a sign or something. And I put it on my list of things to do. I'd love to have a Kentucky historic marker put there of what the place is, that it's the fact that there are probably thousands of people interred there. But if you're just walking down the street, you would never know. I was there yesterday, and it is mowed, it is cared for, but it just looks like an empty lot.
Okay. Yeah, that's definitely a research project for someone.
What are you doing tomorrow?
Yeah, exactly. So you think there were thousands of people?
Well,
there?
I mean, I spent some time over the weekend. I mean, there are a little over 500 on Find a Grave listed as interments, but of course, that's dependent on there being some mention in the paper that Jane Doe died and she's going to be interred at Forest Hill. Otherwise, if somebody died without any heirs, without any family, and the city had to become their, in essence, administrator, there may not be a mention of it. And then the question is, well, where are all those records today? If the city had it up until 2011, surely there's, one would think, a few boxes in a closet somewhere, but I don't know.
So another cemetery that you mentioned to me was the Presbyterian Cemetery that I actually didn't know about this one on North Line between 6th and 7th.
This was a remarkable story. So like the Episcopalians, like the Baptists, like the Catholics, the Presbyterians had their own burying ground. And for a long time, let me find my notes, it was the lot along North Limestone between 6th and 7th Streets and Upper. And today we know it as a residential area of homes, very, very late 19th, very early 20th century construction. And it was historically, at that time at least, it was known as the Waverly Square. And so the Presbyterian Cemetery for a period was well kept, used frequently. After the advent of the Lexington Cemetery, again, like the Catholics, the Presbyterians started predominantly moving over there, frequently reinterring people from the Presbyterian burying ground to the cemetery. And so again, the cemetery did fall into some disuse. Additional people were then buried there. You had some people who maybe weren't Presbyterian. You certainly had African-American burials. You had some people who, again, could not afford to be at the Lexington Cemetery, would end up in what was known as the Presbyterian Cemetery. So in the 1890s, the Presbyterian trustees got together and said, we really don't need this land anymore. We've moved everybody, we think, to the Lexington Cemetery, but if you have someone who has not been moved, we'll help you pay to move them to the Lexington Cemetery. But ultimately, we'd like to sell the land to a developer. And it was very controversial in the paper. People voiced their displeasure at the idea of selling what really was hallowed ground. But ultimately, the trustees' desires won out, despite there was at least one lawsuit filed in Fayette Court to halt the move. But the land today, again, is a residential.
Wow. Next up on our list, what do you have to say about First Hill Cemetery?
First Hill's on West Main Street, across from Rupp Arena, and I've always been curious about it because there is a Kentucky historic marker there that says Pioneer Burying Ground. And it was only when I really started getting into it a couple of years ago that I realized it was called First Hill. What did First Hill mean? And ultimately, at the time, if you were leaving Lexington to go out what's now West Main Street to Leestown Road or to Georgetown Road, First Hill was the literal first hill as you were leaving town on the right. And so it was used as a cemetery, certainly. The Baptist church had a location right there, a church there. It began to fill up, and I mean, you can see from the topography being on that hill as erosion and topsoil would get washed away. But then after the 1833 cholera epidemic, of course, it was over capacity, and the city trustees said, we cannot use that anymore as a cemetery. There have been several Baptist congregations on that lot. The current church, I believe, is an early 20th century structure of very heavy stone, very imposing building, but ultimately the bones of some of the earliest Lexingtonians are under it, including John Bradford. And we did not know that definitively. It was thought that he was there. But again, in the early to mid 20th century, there was some construction going on, and they unearthed a stone that said, "Here lies John Bradford." And I take that as pretty conclusive.
Yeah, I love hearing you talk about these. I can just picture all these locations as you're going through. I'm like mentally going through. I can see it. People have a fascination with cemeteries, and where do you think that comes from?
Cemeteries now, I mean, a lot of cemeteries, most cemeteries are enjoyable places to be for a lot of people. Certainly not all, but like Lexington Cemetery, or even I was over at Cove Haven last week just walking around. It's an attractive place to be, and I don't know, maybe there's some strange, it's something that every human walking the face of the earth has in common, is that ultimately we will not be here one day, whether or not that means we're interred in a cemetery or we're cremated or whatever. But it is something universal to the human condition that is going to happen to all of us.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think it's also it's fun to just go through and imagine, read the names and the dates and imagine what life was like at the time or who the person was. I think it's just adds hours of entertainment for people. And then you get into the symbology of the symbols on the headstones and the styles of headstones. That's a whole other field we could go into into discussion as well.
Yes, you do feel a sense of wanting to relate to these people, whoever they are, whenever they lived. And last week, this happens. Last week, I drove over to Cove Haven because I was reading about Dr. Mary Ellen Britton's father, who was a barber here in town, a very well-respected man, very beloved member of the community. And I thought, I want to go find Dr. Britton's grave, and maybe her family lot is there. So I drove in, and Cove Haven's a decent size. I thought, I'm going to have to walk for a while before I maybe find this. I pull up, I park, I turn my head 45 degrees to the right, and there she is.
Oh, wow.
I mean, but it happens like that.
Yes.
So I got out and, was able to pay my respects to one of Lexington's great citizens.
So, Zach, what kind of sources do you use? How do you do? I know you mentioned some newspaper articles. What are some of the other things you use?
Certainly, newspapers.com is your very first, because that can potentially give you some context that you didn't know existed to work with. We also frequently use Family Search. Through their the algorithm finds hints, and so it can possibly do a lot of the work for you, but maybe you'd be lucky enough to stumble upon a death certificate, which is immensely helpful. And what I do is, if I can find that, I'll download it and attach it to the Find a Grave, because this may be somebody I have zero connection to, but if I can put something on there that a descendant in a year finds and it helps them, I feel like that's again, just something I can do for the cause.
There's just so many more possibilities now with Find a Grave. You can, it gives you the coordinates on Google, then you can Google that and you can find family burial plots that are in really rural areas and things. There's just so many possibilities now with research that used to take months and finding a person who knew about this county and where things were, and like now you can go straight to things.
The Lexington Public Library's Kentucky Room is very helpful, and they have cemetery maps for how many counties, David?
120.
Every county in Kentucky.
Oh, the cemetery maps. It's mostly Fayette and surrounding counties.
Well, it's extremely helpful, especially for cemeteries that are on private property that you might know where it is, sort of where it is, but the maps are really great to have. And then, of course, the Fayette County clerk, Susan Lamb, and her office is doing such a magnificent job digitizing as many of our...
Yes, absolutely. And while you're giving a plug for the Kentucky Room, I'll just go ahead and let everyone know we're available to help with research. You can contact us online, submit questions. Also, definitely stop by. We have lots of historic maps and histories of the counties, and we're always happy to help with research questions. Well, Zach, it's been lovely speaking with you today. Your knowledge is impressive, and it was a fun topic to discuss.
I enjoy it, and you could certainly dive deeper into more specifics, but no, I think it's enjoyable.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Aaron, for having me.
Thanks for listening to Tales from the Kentucky Room, a podcast brought to you by the Central Library's Kentucky Room staff at the Lexington Public Library. If you enjoyed listening, please take a minute to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcast. And please remember to recommend the podcast to friends. If you have any questions about local history or genealogy research, you can visit us in the Kentucky Room to use our collection and newspaper microfilm. Or you can email us at elibrarian@lexpublib.org. That's elibrarian@lexpublib.org. I'm David Bryant, and we'll be back with another episode next month.